first and foremost, in the roundtable discussions, we highlighted the number of challenges risk managers face in collecting control inputs and converting them into the risks insights. Could you share some of the key recommendations and key insights that you found from the discussions during our roundtable, a couple of weeks back?
Yeah, sure, Neil. And thanks really for the opportunity to speak today about what we learned that night. I think it was really fascinating to hear that there was such a consensus around the table of everybody's view in the same sort of space, and so many common problems that we all share. And regarding to the kind of manual nature, there were some particular themes that stood out for me in the discussion, some which we'd anticipated, and it was great to hear that they were reinforcing our views, and some were sort of kind of new inputs for us. I think the things that stood out particularly for me in that piece was, firstly, the need to embrace automation. Unsurprisingly, there's just too much stuff to collect manually. The overhead of doing that's really hard. So in many ways, the historical manual and somewhat subjective assessment methods just don't work for us. We work in a very dynamic environment. We've got to get slicker about this and building a better way of automating this stuff, and to introduce into that some intelligent capabilities. We have to get better around speed and accuracy, and as a consequence of that, increase our confidence of the risk of making decisions. And automation clearly can help streamline so much of that for us, both in terms of creating a pull through of the data, but arriving at something in a much more quick and reliable way. I think the second piece that stood out for me around that was related to the need to implement control monitoring tools. And so many organizations, and certainly in the discussion around the table, we talked about lots of tools that allow us to run our cybersecurity controls. But actually there was an absence around the governance wrapper for that to actually help us understand that despite deploying these tools, do we really have a sense as to how effective they are, and how do we monitor our control effectiveness and to a degree their efficiency? And we need to equip risk managers really in being able to have the capability to not just do point in time assessments, but to build a much more significant ongoing continuous monitoring capability for their own validation about where we stand, but also to be able to work with stakeholders as well, and giving an ongoing view about, are the controls operating as designed? Do we have control gaps? And what are we missing, right? So if you have a better understanding of the risk management portfolio and the things that we should be trying to protect against, where are those blind spots that we're otherwise missing? And then I think the third piece that stood out was around standardization, and in particular around measurement. And so how do we get better and speak more consistently around the way we're measuring it, in a way that when we are speaking to stakeholders, they have a more consistent and go-to understanding really of what we're trying to describe. So often in any one organization, the table and conversation around the table talking about, often we have problems within any single organization about measuring controls in a consistent way, and that problem is even further compounded when we're talking about third parties. We're not trying to run the third party, but we are trying to exert a level of oversight about their ability to both meet and deliver against the obligations they've signed up to as part of our contract with them. And the benefit of risk managers being able to work together to establish a much more sort of consistent and unified approach to control measurement would be a huge win for everybody. And in some ways, an ability to describe more clearly objectives and metrics. And there is no industry reference standard for this typically out there for controls. Assuring the way we measure our control is standardized through an organization and across third parties would be a massive win for us, and certainly take our industry as a step change forward.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. Very comprehensive. And like you said, automation emerged as one of the central themes for us to speak about. And as we progressed in the conversation, I found that a lot of discussion happened about the difficulty risk leaders face in communicating the cyber risk to the stakeholders and to the board. Could you highlight some of the strategies that you found as the best practices that we learned in that discussion? And could other risk leaders learn from some of those best practices. So anything you can share on that front, Simon?
Yeah, I think the conversation was rich. There were a couple of things that really stood out for me. So one of which was, what are we trying to speak about? How are we conveying that information, and what does it look like? And let me unpack that a little bit for you. So I think the first thing that stood out was we need to be much more data driven in how we're having our conversations. And particularly if you put yourself in the stakeholder's shoes, they are typically very data driven individuals who want to make fact-based decisions in their organization. And yet all too often in the cyberspace, we describe it as being risky, but we can't put a number against it. So for risk managers to be equipped to be more data driven in their communication with stakeholders would be really powerful. And we want to move away from relying upon qualitative reports and instead be able to leverage much more quantitative data and specific metrics that provide a clearer understanding of the impact and urgency of our security risks. And of course, that can only be enabled by being able to collect and analyze our relevant data from a variety of sources across our enterprise to support our risk assessment and to be able to deliver that in a much more meaningful way to others in our reporting. I think the second thing is we have historically as an industry always talked about cyber themes, but we've struggled to frame that in an appropriate business context. And certainly in my own experience and echoed around the table, it's really crucial to be able to pivot and start to provide the board and other business stakeholders with a proper business context of when we're communicating security risks as to why those things matter. And if we can even push that to a space where we can describe those risks in terms of financial impact and likelihood, and then align them to what the organization is really trying to do commercially in terms of objectives and priorities, that becomes a much more powerful data-driven conversation that's grounded in reality as to what matters for the business itself. And obviously far more relevant and significant in terms of the vocabulary of the board rather than what typically used in the past. And then the third piece really is about how do we move away from a dry set of metrics presented on a screen, and can we visualize this and describe it in a succinct set of executive dashboards in a way that lands in a much more compelling fashion with our stakeholders. And so visualization through, as I say, the appropriate dashboard and data tools was certainly something that people were craving for in the discussion around the table. That worked very nicely against what we're trying to do within Alfahive to bring that capability to the market and to give tools that allow stakeholders to receive a graphical representation of risk-based information would certainly allow them to much more quickly and intuitively grasp complex concepts that for some individuals just presenting pages of metrics and numbers doesn't really get the message across very well. So whether or not that's through heat maps, trend charts, perhaps interactive dashboards, all of that style of capability allows a risk manager, I think, to present a much more holistic view of the organization's risk landscape and certainly at a glance allow that message to land much more successfully.
Very good, Simon. Thank you for that. And I recall one of the gentlemen from the financial services industry was speaking about that it is not just about the reporting to the board. It is about creating multiple risk treatment options and enabling them to make a decision on behalf of the entire enterprise. And one of the topics that we discussed was about how important it is to have these multiple risk treatment options presented in a manner in which they can be understood in the context of the business, like you just outlined. So any key takeaways from that discussion that you would like to share in terms of the tools or methodologies that you found were interesting for the wider community to adopt?
Yeah, look, so I think you're bang on. It was certainly a subject that resonated very well for me, and I recall on numerous occasions as a CISO having to navigate. Well, look, with a finite budget, what are my most significant risks, and where do I want to deploy my available budget to create the most meaningful risk reduction impact, but also how do I model that and describe it? And so it was certainly a very alive topic around the table as to, how people would benefit from the availability of tools that allow them to model different scenarios, multiple risk treatment options, work through the what if scenario with that, and feel confident that it's not just a kind of wet finger in the air as to whether or not I spend money on X or Y, but they can justify their decisions. And really, by allowing people, providing a capability to work through those various scenarios, you have greater confidence that you can arrive at much more informed decisions that you can support and justify related to your proposed control improvement plans, and to be able to prioritize those efforts based upon the most significant potential financial impact or reduction of risk for your organization, which is exactly where we want to be. Now, in many ways, that's easy said, it's much harder to implement. And so the conversation at that point, turn to the gnarly issue of, well, actually, how do we really do that? Because that feels a bit of a nirvana. And we spent some time talking about quantitative risk assessment, QRA tools.
Yeah.
Everyone was clearly bought into the fact that the value in adopting QRA tools was significant. There was absolutely a desire around the table to understand more about how risk managers could assign numerical values to risk, and by doing so enable a much more objective and consistent evaluation of their potential impact and likelihood. And the ability to walk somebody else through those numbers to justify your thinking is clearly a significant step forward for most organizations. Now, whether or not that needs to incorporate statistical models, historical data, or a number of other factors that allow us to calculate risk scores and provide a quantitative basis for our decision making is where the proof of the pudding sits. But absolutely, that's what people were seeking. And on the back of that, the need to be able to use that data to then model decision support systems. And people around the table, my peers, were absolutely of a view that we need to be able to integrate data from a variety of sources to be able to automate that risk assessment process based upon the inputs, and to, as cleanly and efficiently as possible, provide decision makers, often the CISO, but not limited to the CISO, with comprehensive information that really allows you to evaluate a number of mitigation strategies and to decide where you want to put that money. And that, I think, would take a lot of the guesswork out of the process we often go through, and allow us to both support and justify what in some cases can be quite material investment decisions for a company to make.
Excellent, Simon. Thank you for that. And I think that kind of brings me to the final point. And before I ask that, my reflection was that after hearing the 12 senior security and risk leaders, that it is clear that cyber risk management is burdened with inefficiency and subjectivity in the risk. And at Alfahive, we are on the mission to modernize the cyber risk management using the power of automation and data-driven technologies. So in summary, if you were to summarize a couple of key takeaways which were most useful to help us push our agenda of moving in that direction and make the meaningful difference in the cyber risk management journeys, make it easy for the people to convert the controls into the risk insights, make it easy for them to quantify the risk and not get buried in the data and all of the models that you would probably need to build. What would be the couple of points that you would like to leave with as a final summary?
Okay. Well, look, I think firstly, I take it in the context of we need to release our people from the burden of the manual processes and all the difficulty of arriving at generating the data, and freeing up our people to be as brilliant as they can about using that data to make really good decisions. And there are some things that feed into that. to unlock that opportunity. So firstly, and we've touched upon this a little bit already, standardizing and perhaps centralizing our risk processes.
Yeah.
You know, the need to be able to achieve that across the organization, and whether or not that comes to life through standardized methodologies, the use of consistent templates, or even optimizing the workflows to allow that consistent risk assessment, documentation, and the reporting to take place is absolutely the right thing we should be striving for. I think hand in glove with that would be centralizing risk processes. So we want a dedicated risk management process, platform, system, whatever you want to call it, that allows collaboration across the enterprise. We want to strip out all the duplication that always happens, particularly when you're using a manual process distributed across your firm. And we want to be much more uniform in how we're approaching risk management. So centralization and standardization would be the first big thing. I think the second thing is, well, what do you do with that data? We have to get better at knowledge sharing and collaboration. So I think if we can improve our ability to do that across risk management teams, that's a massive win. Cross-functional collaboration, the power of the collective brilliance through collective expertise is you know, a great step forward. And also, nobody has a monopoly upon good ideas. So the ability to share best practices to overcome sort of inconsistencies about how we do it manually would be really powerful. So the idea of collaborative platforms, people talked about regular knowledge sharing sessions, and even training programs to enhance our institutional capability about fostering continuous learning and the subsequent improvement that comes with that within enterprises is a big desire. And then I think the last thing I heard was continuous monitoring, and not just that, but adaptive risk management. Risk management shouldn't be something where you work through the model, you put it on a shelf and tick the box to say, I've done that. It should be an everyday event that responds to a changing environment around you, whether or not it's as the business changes or the threat environment that the organization is looking at also morphs, and therefore we need to change our models accordingly. So the idea of continuous management rather than episodic risk management was something that people talked about a lot. And if we can move to a continuous monitoring capability, we can indeed proactively detect the emerging risks and our control response before it becomes a significant issue, as we observe that things need to be adjusted. And prevention is clearly better than cure in these circumstances. So continuous monitoring, regular, timely feedback loops, and the risk intelligence that comes with it will absolutely improve our consistency and agility in risk management. And there was unequivocally a resounding desire around that table for us to be able to arrive at that place for our industry.
Very good, Simon. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to speak with you as always, and I look forward to hosting another such roundtable. It was a brilliant place for me to personally learn and reflect on some of the problems that we are solving as part of Alfahive's mission. And thank you for the time.